My sister let our parents destroy me for her mistake and laughed while they kicked me out. So I cut her out forever. 6 years later, she's begging me to save her from the same fate. When my sister turned my back on me 24 hours after I risked my life for her. Me and her grew up in an ultra-religious household, complete with the kind of crazy mom who beat it into us that we'd burn in hell if we ever sinned. I grew up terrified of her in the church, but as I got older, I started rebelling in my own little ways. I'd make friends with people who weren't Christian. I'd come down with terrible fevers on Sundays, and I'd always try to teach my sister that she was her own person with a choice. That was my mistake, because just a few weeks after my first conversation with her about it, I noticed something was off with her. She started getting pale and queasy every morning. She withdrew into herself and stopped talking to everyone except me. After a lot of pressing when our parents weren't present, she admitted that she had gotten pregnant. My eyes went wide. I started asking her if she was ready to be a mother, and that's when she broke down and said she had already terminated the baby with the help of a school counselor. I told her it was okay. She had nothing to worry about, but it turns out she did, because our parents found the pregnancy test in the bathroom bin a few days later. They came into our room more excited than ever, asking which one of us was blessed enough to have a baby. I glanced over at Emily, and she was absolutely trembling. She looked like she was about to pass out from fear. And so, like the protective older sister I was, I blurted out, "It was me." My parents looked ecstatic. But then I continued, "I didn't want it. I got it terminated." In fact, it made me realize I never want kids in my life. Just like that, my parents went white, then absolutely exploded. Mom started screaming that I was an abomination who was going to suffer in hell for eternity, and my dad stared with silent disgust. They wasted no time dragging me before the church elders next Sunday. I stood there shaking and humiliated, while the pastors called me unclean, and demanded I publicly confess to everyone or leave forever. It felt unreal, watching my life unravel because I wanted to protect my sister. That night, with my parents telling me to repent or be gone, I stuffed some clothes in a bag and left. I spent the night sleeping curled up in my car, and my sister texted me, promising we'd always stay close, thanking me over and over. I clung to that text like everything I'd lost had been worth it to protect her, but that didn't last. Because from literally the next morning on, Emily's responses were extremely slow. She didn't FaceTime like she promised. She didn't text back like she said she would. The one message I got from her hinted at the fact I was no longer her sister. I remember being desperate, borderline spamming her asking her if she was okay. I thought this was my parents doing. Until I realized the cold truth. It happened the night an old friend of mine from church who's similar to me messaged out of nowhere. She told me she heard about me. According to her, our parents had turned me into a villain in our church, and our sister into some sort of hero. And apparently, my sister was eating it up. Last week, she even supposedly spoke about me being not right for this world in front of the entire congregation while my parents looked on. I was crushed, devastated. What's worse is that by this point, I was already getting max one reply per day. And within a week, my sister stopped texting back entirely. I actually drove to her school one of the days, hoping this was all some misunderstanding. But when she saw me, she turned away and walked off. She wouldn't say a word. My parents unblocked my number just to call me later that day and yelled at me that I was mentally unstable and manipulative. I heard my sister in the background. She was laughing. I thought about exposing her, about dropping the truth there and then, but I decided against it. Staying in that house with them was punishment enough. I hung up and forced myself to forget. It's 6 years later now, and a few weeks ago, my cousin reached out to me. She told me about a big family gathering that was happening, and said my parents told her to invite me because there's something they need to tell me. I thought about it, and though that part of my life had long sailed, I still went because I wanted to see my sister again, even if it was just for closure. But then I arrived, and reality slapped me really hard. What my parents wanted to tell me wasn't an apology or anything, but rather that Emily had just given birth to a baby boy. The father was there, a 41-year-old regular member of the church. My sister was dressed in all white and was sitting with perfect posture, no emotion on her face, and was being praised for being a good Christian mother. Throughout that whole night, nobody really talked to me, not even my sister. I got no apology, no closure. At least, that's what I thought. Because as I was walking upstairs, she cornered, "Sis, I'm sorry. You gotta help me." My heart dropped into my stomach as I looked into her eyes and saw the terrified 16-year-old girl I'd tried to save all those years ago, trapped now in a woman's body with a baby in her arms and a wedding ring that looked more like a shackle. She pulled me into the upstairs bathroom and locked the door. The baby was downstairs with Harold, and she kept glancing at the door like he might burst through any second. Her hands were shaking as she told me everything. The bathroom hadn't changed much since we were kids. Same faded floral wallpaper, Same cracked tile by the tub where I dropped Mom's ceramic angel figurine when I was 12. Emily sat on the closed toilet lid, wringing her hands in her lap while I leaned against the sink trying to process what she was saying. She said our parents had forced her to marry Harold when she turned 18. They called it redemption for her sin, a way to make things right with God. She tried to refuse, but they threatened to kick her out with nothing, just like they've done to me. Harold had been interested in her since she was 15, always finding excuses to talk to her after church, bringing her little gifts, bookmarks with Bible verses, homemade cookies from his mother, a bracelet with a tiny cross charm. Our parents saw him as the perfect solution. He was 28, established in his father's construction business, a deacon in the church. What more could they want for their wayward daughter? I asked her why she turned on me all those years ago. She started crying, these quiet sobs that shook her whole body. She said she was terrified and desperate. Our parents had told her that if she didn't denounce me publicly, they'd investigate deeper and find out the truth. They'd already been suspicious because she was the one who'd been sick every morning, the one who'd been sneaking crackers into her room to settle her stomach. So she did what they wanted. She gave speeches about how I corrupted her, how I brought sin into their godly home. She ignored my texts, all those desperate messages I'd sent from the parking lot of the shelter where I'd spent my first night. She laughed when they called me a whore, a Jezebel, a stain on the family name. Every word felt like a knife twisting in my chest. But looking at her now, trapped in this nightmare of a marriage, her face gaunt and her eyes hollow, I couldn't stay angry. I told her I'd help her get out. We started planning right there in that bathroom, whispering like we used to when we were kids plotting to sneak extra dessert. She said Harold monitored everything, her phone, her bank account, where she went, and who she talked to. He'd even installed tracking apps on her devices hidden behind innocent-looking icons. Our parents backed him up completely, saying a wife should submit to her husband in all things. She couldn't even go to the grocery store without him or someone from church accompanying her. The one time she tried, he'd shown up 15 minutes later, all smiles for the other shoppers while his grip on her arm left bruises. I gave her my number, writing it on a piece of toilet paper with an eyeliner pencil I found in the drawer. I told her to memorize it, then delete it. We have to be careful. I said I'd look into women's shelters and figure out how to get her and the baby somewhere safe. She hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, whispering thank you over and over into my shoulder. She smelled like the same vanilla lotion she'd used in high school, but underneath was something else. Fear, maybe, or just the staleness of a life lived in captivity. When we came out of the bathroom, Harold was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. He's this tall, thin guy with cold eyes and a smile that never reaches them. His hair was perfectly combed, not a strand out of place, and he wore the same style of polo shirt and khakis that all the churchmen favored. Modest, unremarkable, designed to blend in. He asked Emily what took so long. His voice friendly, but with this edge underneath, like a knife wrapped in velvet. She mumbled something about the baby making her emotional and needing a moment. He stared at me for a long second, his pale blue eyes calculating before taking her arm and leading her back to the living room. I noticed how she flinched slightly at his touch, how her shoulders tensed. I left shortly after that, making excuses about the long drive back to the city. The house felt suffocating. All those family photos on the walls showing smiling faces that hid so much pain. The drive home felt surreal. Like, I'd stepped back in time and found everything exactly as horrible as I'd left it, just with new paint. The same streets, the same church steeple visible from the highway, the same weight pressing down on my chest. Over the next few days, I threw myself into research. I found shelters in nearby cities that specialized in religious abuse cases, looked up lawyers who did pro bono work for domestic violence survivors, even watched YouTube videos about recognizing tracking apps on phones. My laptop screen became a maze of tabs, estate planning checklists, state custody laws, forums for ex-fundamentalist women sharing their stories. Emily managed to text me from a friend's phone saying Harold had gotten suspicious about us talking and was watching her more closely. She'd had to tell him I'd only come to see the baby, that we'd barely spoken. We decided to meet in person instead. She told Harold she was joining a Mommy and Me class at the library. He'd actually called to verify such a class existed before allowing her to sign up. Really, she was meeting me at a coffee shop across town. A little place I'd found that was far enough from their neighborhood that we wouldn't run into anyone from church. She looked exhausted with dark circles under her eyes and this jumpy way of glancing around every few seconds. The baby, Timothy, slept in his carrier while she told me more details. She kept touching him, like she needed to reassure herself he was still there. Harold controlled all the money. He gave her a $20 allowance each week for personal items, and she had to show receipts for everything. If she couldn't account for every penny, he'd lecture her for hours about stewardship and wifely duties. He picked out her clothes each morning, laying them on the bed before he left for work. Always long skirts, high necklines, Nothing that might attract another man's attention. He approved her meals, checking the grocery receipts to make sure she wasn't buying anything frivolous or unhealthy. He'd convinced her to quit her job at the Christian bookstore because wives shouldn't work outside the home. Though, really, it was because her coworker had been telling her about a cousin who'd left an abusive marriage. He'd even started talking about having more kids, lots of them, to build a proper Christian family. Equivocal, he called it. Like children wear arrows in God's army. I started slowly moving some of her things to a storage unit I'd rented under a fake name. Just small stuff at first. Some clothes that actually fit her personality instead of his demands. Important documents she managed to copy when he was at work. A few photos from before when we were just kids who didn't know how cruel the world could be. We met once a week at different locations. Always somewhere public, but not too close to home. A park one week where we could push Timothy on the baby swings. A McDonald's the next where the noise would cover our conversations. Always watching for anyone who might recognize us from the old days. Then the text started. Unknown numbers sending me messages like, "Stay away from what isn't yours, and God sees everything you do." The area codes were local, and the language had that particular flavor of religious threat I remembered so well. I knew it had to be Harold or someone from the church, but I couldn't prove it. The messages got more threatening, talking about how accidents happen to people who interfere with God's plan, reminding me of my past sins, and suggesting I should focus on my own repentance instead of corrupting others. Emily was getting more scared too. Harold had started checking the mileage on her car, making sure it matched up with where she said she'd been. He'd calculated the exact distance to every approved location. The grocery store, the library, the church. If she was even a mile over, he'd interrogate her about where she'd gone. He'd call the places she said she was going to verify she was really there, chatting with the librarians and store clerks like a concerned husband just checking in. Once he showed up at the library during the fake mommy class, and she had to pretend she'd gotten the day wrong. She spent the whole hour reading picture books to Timothy in the children's section while Harold browsed the Christian living shelf nearby. We switched to only meeting when Harold was definitely busy. Church elder meetings on Tuesday nights, men's Bible study on Thursdays. Even then, we kept it short, maybe 20 minutes at most. I'd give her prepaid phones to hide, but he kept finding them. He'd tear apart her closet looking for evidence of something, though he never said what. Once he found one tucked inside a box of tampons, the one place she thought he'd never look. His face had gone cold and quiet, which she said was worse than when he yelled. My mom started calling me too. Not to apologize or anything, but to lecture me about staying away from Emily's marriage. She said I was trying to destroy a union blessed by God, that I was still the same selfish girl who'd called her grandchild. The words were familiar, worn smooth by years of repetition. I hung up on her mid-sentence, but not before I heard my father in the background, quoting scripture about honoring my father and mother. One night, Emily didn't show up to our meeting spot. I waited at the park for an hour, watching families pack up their picnics as the sun set, texting the latest burner phone I'd given her. Nothing. I drove by their house, but all the lights were off. The driveway was empty except for Emily's car. Then I remembered she'd mentioned Harold was supposed to be at a church thing until late. Some planning meeting for the men's retreat. I parked down the street and snuck through the backyard, my heart pounding. The house was one of those cookie-cutter places the church helped young families buy. All beige siding and perfect lawns. Every house on the street looked identical, like a neighborhood of clones. I could see a light on in what used to be our bedroom when we were kids, back when Emily and I would stay up late whispering about boys and dreams and futures that seemed so bright. The back door was locked, but I remembered the spare key our family always hid under the fake rock by the garden. Some habits never change. The rock was exactly where it had always been, next to Mom's prized rose bushes. I let myself in as quietly as possible, my heart hammering so loud, I was sure the neighbors could hear it. The house smelled like pot roast and lemon pledge. Exactly like our childhood home. I found Emily locked in the bedroom, sitting on the floor with her knees pulled up to her chest. She had a bruise on her wrist shaped like fingers, purple and green like a sick bracelet. Her face was blotchy from crying. She said Harold had found one of the phones and lost it. He'd taken Timothy to his mother's house and locked her in here to pray about her deception. The room was bare except for a bed and dresser. No books, no TV, nothing that might distract from contemplation of her sins. I helped her pack a bag right then. Just essentials. Clothes, diapers, formula, the few personal items Harold allowed her to keep. We were almost to the stairs when the front door opened. My mom stood there with her arms crossed, looking between us with this expression of disappointment mixed with something else. Fear, maybe, or recognition. She asked what we thought we were doing. Her voice had that same controlled tone I remembered from childhood, the one that meant danger. Emily started to stammer out an explanation, but I cut her off. I told Mom we were leaving and she couldn't stop us. That's when she surprised me. She said she knew. She knew about Harold's controlling behavior, about the bruises Emily tried to hide with makeup, about the way he isolated her from everyone. Her voice got quiet as she admitted she'd been trapped the same way with our father for 30 years, too scared to speak up, too brainwashed to believe she deserved better. She touched her own wrist absently, and I wondered what bruises she'd hidden over the years. I wanted to scream at her. Where was this revelation when she was beating us for minor sins? Where was this understanding when she threw me out? But Emily grabbed my hand and squeezed, and I kept my mouth shut. There would be time for anger later. Mom said she'd help us. She'd tell Harold and Dad that Emily was at a women's prayer retreat for a few days. It would buy us time to get away properly. Even gave us an envelope with cash she'd been hiding for years, money she'd skimmed from the grocery budget and tucked away just in case. Her hands shook as she handed it over, and I saw my father's car pulling into the driveway. We loaded Emily's stuff into my car while Mom kept watch. She hugged Emily goodbye, but didn't try to touch me. I was fine with that. As we drove away, I saw her in the rearview mirror, standing in the driveway looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. My father was getting out of his car and I saw her shoulders straighten as she prepared to lie for us. I'd arranged for Emily to stay at a shelter 2 hours away. They specialized in helping women from religious communities, understood the specific challenges and fears. The building was nondescript, could have been any office complex, but inside it was warm and welcoming. The intake worker was this kind woman named Betty, who didn't judge when Emily broke down crying during the paperwork. She just handed over tissues and said it was brave to leave, that God wanted more for his daughters than fear and control. But Harold wasn't done. He filed a missing persons report, claiming Emily had postpartum depression and wasn't thinking clearly. The police showed up at the shelter, but Emily was able to tell them she was there voluntarily. Harold then tried to get custody of Timothy through the church's informal court system they used to settle disputes. It wasn't legally binding, but in their community, it might as well have been law. That's when I started reaching out to other women from our old church. Patricia, the one who'd first told me about Emily's speeches against me, was surprisingly helpful. She gave me names of other women who'd been in similar situations, who'd been married off young to older men and suffered in silence. Her own daughter was 17 and being courted by a man in his 30s. She was starting to see the pattern. I spent weeks collecting their stories. Margaret talked about her husband monitoring her phone calls, how he'd installed recording software and listened to every conversation later. Jessica described being locked in her house for days as punishment for smiling at the grocery store clerk. Diane still had scars from where her husband had struck her for wearing a skirt he deemed too short. It had shown her ankles. Most were too scared to speak publicly, but they wrote statements about the pattern of abuse in the church. Some sent them from library computers, terrified their husbands would find out. Emily's divorce lawyer, this tough woman named Val who'd escaped a cult herself, said the statements would help, but we needed more. Harold was well respected in the community, a business owner who donated generously to the church. He had character witnesses lined up for miles, pastors, elders, business associates who saw only his public face. Then we caught a break. Timothy got sick, just a cold, but Emily had to take him to the doctor. Harold showed up at the clinic and caused a scene, screaming at Emily in the waiting room about defying his authority, grabbing her arm hard enough to leave marks. He accused her of poisoning their son's mind against him, of being an unfit mother who needed a man's guidance. The whole thing was caught on security cameras. Several patients gave statements about what they'd witnessed, including an elderly woman who said it reminded her of her own abusive marriage decades ago. Harold backed off for a while after that, but he started a whisper campaign in the church community, saying Emily was mentally unstable, that I brainwashed her into abandoning her family. Some people believed him. Others who'd seen too much over the years started quietly supporting Emily. The church began to divide, though most kept their opinions quiet. The custody battle was brutal. Harold's lawyer painted Emily as an unfit mother who'd abandoned her child. They brought up the old termination of pregnancy story, somehow twisting it to make her look unstable even though it had supposedly been me. Our father testified about what a good Christian man Harold was. How he'd taken on the burden of a wayward girl and tried to guide her to righteousness. Church elders spoke about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of keeping families together. But our lawyer had those security tapes. She had the statements from other women. She had documentation of Harold's financial control, the tracking apps, the isolation. She found a pattern of behavior that was hard to ignore. Slowly, the truth started coming out. During all this, Emily and I were rebuilding our relationship. We'd stay up late in her tiny shelter apartment, talking about everything we'd missed in each other's lives. She told me about the years of pretending, of hating herself or betraying me, of feeling trapped in a life she never wanted. She talked about her wedding day, how she'd thrown up before walking down the aisle, how our mother had told her it was just nerves and God would help her learn to love Harold. I told her about sleeping in my car, about building a life from nothing, about the therapy that helped me understand our upbringing was abuse, not love. We cried together, laughed together, slowly became sisters again. The church started fracturing. Some members stood by Harold in the old ways. Others began questioning what they've been taught about submission and obedience. A group of younger women started meeting secretly to discuss their own experiences. They met in Margaret's basement while their husbands thought they were at quilting circle. The pastor tried to shut it down, but they kept meeting anyway, growing bolder with each gathering. Harold got desperate. He started showing up places he knew Emily would be, not violating the restraining order technically, but skirting right up to the edge. He'd sit in his car outside the grocery store. He'd drive slowly past the shelter. Once he left a Bible on my car windshield with verses about wives submitting to husbands highlighted in yellow. Another time, he sent flowers to the shelter with a note about forgiveness and reconciliation. Then he made a mistake. He sent a text to Emily from a friend's phone, threatening to take Timothy out of state where she'd never find them. He probably meant to delete it, but forgot. Our lawyer immediately filed emergency motions with the court. The final hearing was on a Thursday. The courtroom was packed with church members on both sides. Harold sat there in his best suit looking like butter wouldn't melt in his mouth. Our parents were behind him. My father's hand on his shoulder in support. My mother stared straight ahead, not looking at either Emily or me. But when the judge reviewed everything, the surveillance footage, the threatening texts, the pattern of control and abuse documented by multiple women, she made her decision clear. Emily got full custody. Harold got supervised visitation once a week. He'd have to complete anger management and parenting classes before even that. He turned red, then white. Started shouting about God's law superseding man's law. Security had to escort him out while he screamed Bible verses about lives and submission. Our father followed, yelling about how we destroyed a sacred union. Our mother sat there for a moment longer, then quietly got up and left without looking at either of us. Outside the courthouse, Emily held Timothy close and cried. Not sad tears this time, but relief. We went to lunch at this little diner to celebrate. Halfway through our sandwiches, she got a text, then another, then dozens. Women from the church were reaching out, some offering support, others asking for help with their own situations. One message was from our mom. All it said was, "I'm proud of you both." Emily's still figuring things out. She's got a job now at a daycare where Timothy can come with her. She's taking online classes to finish her degree. We have dinner together every Sunday. Our own kind of church, where the only sermon is about surviving and building something better. Harold still tries his manipulations. He tells Timothy mommy is keeping them apart. He files complaints with child services that always get dismissed. He posts passive-aggressive Bible verses on social media, but he has no power anymore. The spell is broken. Last week, Emily sent me a photo from the park. Her and Timothy on the swings, both laughing in the sunshine. She was wearing jeans and a t-shirt, her hair down and messy. She looked free. She looked like herself again. Sometimes I think about that night I took the blame for her pregnancy. How different things might have been if I'd stayed quiet. But then I see her now, building a real life on her own terms, and I know I'd do it again. That's what sisters do. We protect each other even when it costs everything, even when they can't protect us back right away. The church is different now too. That group of women who started meeting grew into something bigger. They pushed out some of the worst elders. They started programs to help young women get education and job training. It's not perfect, probably never will be, but it's better. And our mom? She finally left our father last month. Showed up at Emily's apartment with 2 suitcases and tear-stained cheeks. We're working on forgiveness, all 3 of us. It's hard and messy, and some days I still want to scream at her about everything she put us through, but she's trying. She watches Timothy while Emily's at work. She's going to therapy. She even apologized to me. Really apologized for throwing me out all those years ago. Healing isn't linear. Some days are harder than others. Harold's still out there, still trying to maintain control however he can. The church community is still divided. Our father still sends letters about repentance and damnation, but we're building something new from the ashes of what was, and for the first time in our lives, we're doing it together. The healing thing is harder than I expected. Emily's doing better, but Harold keeps finding new ways to mess with us. Last month, he convinced some church members that Emily was poisoning Timothy against him. They started showing up at the daycare where she works, standing outside with signs about godly parenting. The daycare director had to call the cops twice. Then Harold filed a complaint saying Emily was neglecting Timothy's spiritual education. He got 3 church elders to write letters about how important it was for children to be raised in the faith. Our lawyer shut that down quick, but it still rattled Emily. She started second-guessing everything, wondering if she was damaging her son by keeping him away from church. I told her that was ridiculous. Timothy was happy and healthy and loved. That's what mattered. But I could see the old programming kicking in. All those years of being told she was worthless without the church's approval. Things got worse when Harold started dating again. This 19-year-old girl from the youth group named Sarah. Her parents were thrilled their daughter had caught the attention of such a godly man. Never mind that he was twice her age with a history of abuse. In their world, a divorced man was still better than no man at all. Emily found out when Timothy came back from visitation talking about his new mommy. Harold had been telling him that Sarah would be his real mother soon. That Emily was just confused and would realize her mistake eventually. Timothy was only 3 and didn't understand why mommy got so upset. We went back to the lawyer, but there wasn't much we could do. Harold was allowed to date whoever he wanted during his visitation time. As long as he wasn't directly harming Timothy, the court wouldn't intervene. Val said to document everything and wait for him to mess up again. He always did eventually. The mess up came sooner than expected. Sarah reached out to Emily through Facebook, asking to meet. Emily was suspicious, but I convinced her to go. We met at a Starbucks downtown far from Harold's usual spots. Sarah looked even younger in person, wearing one of those shapeless dresses the church girls always wore. Her hair in a braid so tight it pulled at her temples. She was pregnant, 4 months along and terrified. Harold had been everything she dreamed of at first. Attentive, generous, talking about their future family. Then they got engaged and things changed. He started controlling what she wore, who she talked to, where she went. He'd installed those same tracking apps on her phone. When she tried to talk to her parents, they told her she was blessed to have such a protective husband. The worst part was what he'd said about Emily. He told Sarah that Emily had mental problems, that she'd tried to call Timothy multiple times, that the only reason he divorced her was to protect their son. He said once they were married, they'd get full custody and raise Timothy properly. Sarah had believed it all until she'd seen the court documents at his house, the real ones that talked about his abuse. Emily's hands shook as she listened. I could see her wanting to run to pretend this wasn't happening, but she stayed. She told Sarah the truth about everything. The control, the isolation, the bruises hidden under long sleeves. She showed her pictures from the security footage at the doctor's office. Sarah went pale. We gave her Val's number and told her she had options. She didn't have to marry him. She could leave, get help, protect herself and her baby. She cried and said her parents would disown her. Another single mother bringing shame on the family. Emily reached across the table and took her hand. Told her shame was better than fear. Freedom was better than prison. Even a prison decorated with Bible verses. Sarah left that day still engaged to Harold, but she called Val the next week. Then she disappeared from church, from Harold's social media, from everywhere. Her parents filed a missing persons report, but she was smart enough to call and tell them she was safe, just not coming back. Harold went ballistic. He showed up at Emily's apartment screaming about how she'd corrupted another innocent girl. The neighbors called the cops, and he got arrested for violating the restraining order. Just a night in jail and a fine, but it was something. His reputation in the community took another hit. Even some of his supporters started wondering why godly women kept running from him. Our mom was actually helpful during all this. She'd been going to therapy and unpacking her own trauma. She told us stories about our grandmother, how she'd been struck for reading romance novels, forced to marry at 16. The cycle went back generations. Each woman passing down the pain because they didn't know any other way. She started coming to court hearings, sitting on our side of the room. Our father would glare at her, but she'd stare straight ahead, her jaw set. After one hearing where Harold's lawyer tried to paint Emily as a homewrecker for helping Sarah, Mom stood up and called him a liar in front of everyone. Security had to step in, but the damage was done. One of the most respected church mothers had publicly taken a stand. The church split got worse after that. The old guard doubled down, preaching about women who'd lost their way, but more families started leaving. Patricia pulled her daughter out of the youth group when they started pushing her toward an older man. Margaret's husband found her secret meeting notes and filed for divorce, but she said it was a relief. The foundation was cracking. Then Timothy started having nightmares. He'd wake up screaming about Daddy taking him away, about the mean lady who said Mommy was bad. Emily took him to a child therapist who documented everything. The therapist said Harold had been engaging in parental alienation, trying to turn Timothy against his mother. It was textbook emotional abuse. We went back to court with the new evidence. Harold showed up with Sarah's parents who testified about how Emily had corrupted their daughter. They actually blamed her for Sarah's pregnancy, said she'd encouraged their daughter to sin. The judge didn't buy it. She reduced Harold's visitation to once a month, supervised by a social worker. Harold's business started suffering. Turns out word had gotten around about his treatment of women. Some of his clients pulled their contracts. His father threatened to cut him out of the company if he didn't get his act together, but Harold couldn't help himself. He kept posting online about godly marriages and submissive wives, alienating more people each time. Emily got stronger through all this. She started making friends at work, going to single-parent support groups. She even went on a few dates, though she was super careful about who she trusted. Timothy started preschool and loved it. He stopped having nightmares, started laughing more. Normal kid stuff that felt like miracles after everything they'd been through. I was doing better too. My job was going well. I'd moved to a nicer apartment. I'd even started dating this guy named James who understood why I flinched when people quoted scripture. We took things slow, but it was good. Healthy. Nothing like the relationships I'd seen growing up. Then our father had a heart attack. Massive one that put him in the ICU. Mom called us both crying. Emily didn't want to go, but I convinced her we should. Not for him, but for us. To see him powerless for once. He looked small in that hospital bed. Tubes everywhere. Machines beeping. The man who terrorized our childhood reduced to weak flesh. He was awake when we came in. His eyes widened when he saw us together. He tried to speak but couldn't around the ventilator. Mom said he'd been asking for us. Wanted to make things right before he died. I almost laughed. How do you make right decades of abuse? But Emily surprised me. She walked up to his bed and stared down at him, told him she forgave him. Not for his sake, but for hers. She didn't want to carry his poison anymore. I couldn't do it. I stood there looking at him, remembering every beating, every cruel word, every time he'd chosen his twisted version of God over his daughters. I didn't forgive him. I just told him I hoped he found peace. Then I left. He died 3 days later. The funeral was packed with church people praising him as a godly man. Harold gave a speech about learning from his example. Emily and I sat in the back row, holding hands, counting the minutes until we could leave. Mom sat up front in widow's black, finally free but not sure what to do with it. After the funeral, Harold cornered Emily outside, told her this was a sign she needed to come back. That God was calling their family to reunite. She laughed in his face, actually laughed, told him God had better things to do than worry about his control issues. He turned red and raised his hand like he was going to hit her. James stepped between them. Harold backed down, but the damage was done. Multiple witnesses saw him almost assault her at her father's funeral. The final custody hearing was last month. Harold had run out of tricks. His reputation was destroyed, his business failing, even the church distancing themselves from him. He showed up alone. No more character witnesses willing to testify. His lawyer tried one last time to paint Emily as an unfit mother, but the judge had heard enough. She terminated his parental rights, said his pattern of abuse and manipulation made him a danger to Timothy. He could petition to reinstate them after completing extensive therapy and parenting classes, but for now, he was done. Emily got sole custody. No visitation. Harold stood up and started yelling about injustice, about God's law. The judge threatened him with contempt. He stormed out, slamming doors. That was 6 weeks ago. He's filed 3 appeals already. All denied. Last I heard, he moved back in with his parents, spending his days posting angry rants online that fewer and fewer people read. Emily's thriving now. She got promoted at the daycare, started taking night classes to become a teacher. Timothy's in kindergarten, making friends, being a normal kid. They moved to a bigger apartment with a yard where he can play. She even got a dog, this goofy golden retriever that Timothy named Captain. Mom lives with him now. She helps with Timothy, cooks dinner, trying to be the mother she never was to us. It's weird, but it works. She's even started speaking out about religious abuse, sharing her story at women's shelters. Small steps toward redemption. The church is barely recognizable. So many families left that they had to merge with another congregation. The old guard lost power. Some of the younger members started new churches focused on love and acceptance instead of control. Patricia leads a support group for women leading abusive religious marriages. Margaret went back to school to become a counselor. Even Sarah reached out last week to say thank you. She had her baby, a little girl she's raising alone, but happy. And me? I'm good, better than good. James and I moved in together last month. He makes me laugh, respects my boundaries, doesn't think my past defines me. We're talking about marriage, but there's no rush. We'll do it when we're ready on our terms. Emily and I have dinner every Sunday like always. Sometimes Mom joins us. Sometimes it's just us sisters. We cook together. Timothy plays with the dog. We talk about everything and nothing. Normal family stuff that feels extraordinary because we chose it. Last week, Emily showed me a letter she'd written to our father. She never sent it. He was already gone, but she needed to write it. It talked about forgiveness and moving forward, about breaking cycles and choosing love. She burned it in the backyard while Timothy played on his swing set. The smoke drifted up into the sky and disappeared. I think about that sometimes.